So Hamlet is the most famous piece of literature in the English language, but it's also Shakespeare's least known play. It's most famous because we all know the story, and most people in the English-speaking world and beyond, certainly most people who've passed through this university, can quote some of its lines. To be or not to be, alas, poor Yorick, the rest is silence. Hamlet's the most frequently performed of Shakespeare's plays, and we can see it on screen, starring every generation's leading actors, from Laurence Olivier to Mel Gibson to Ethan Hawke to Benedict Cumberbatch. But it's also his least known play, because the version we all know is not the only Hamlet. There was a Hamlet before Hamlet, one that we almost never see on stage or screen, that very few people outside of research universities have ever read. For nearly 2 centuries now, scholars have debated exactly what to make of this other Hamlet, and how to reconcile it with the more familiar version of the play. Here, as so often, Hamlet slips through our grasp, refusing our efforts, as he himself puts it, to pluck out the heart of his mystery. The story of this other Hamlet begins 200 years after Shakespeare's death, in the small village of Great Barton, in the southeast of England. The year is 1823, and Sir Henry Bunbury has recently inherited Barton Hall, the manor house of the village, from his father. While inventorying his new possessions, Bunbury found in one of the closets a book that he described as a small quarto, barbarously cropped and very ill bound. This was the first quarto of Hamlet, or Q1, published a year prior to the earliest text of the play then known, and at that time the only copy thought to exist. The Hamlet we know from modern editions and performances, and the only Hamlet anyone knew until the discovery of Q1, is a conflation of 2 other early editions: the second quarto, published in 1604, and the text from the first folio of 1623. Since the early 18th century, editors have combined these 2 texts, though each contains lines not in the other, and created our modern version of the play. And while these 2 texts differ in a number of lines, the second quarto may derive from Shakespeare's manuscript, while the folio text seems to have been lightly altered in getting the play ready for the stage. Nonetheless, they're fundamentally the same. The text contained in Q1, on the other hand, is far stranger, even though the play is recognizably a version of Hamlet as we know it. When Bunbury made his discovery in the closet of Barton Hall, readers suddenly had to confront this bizarre alternate version of the greatest English play, one claiming to be by William Shakespeare, but sounding at times rather un-Shakespearean. Here, for instance, as I'll show you in a moment, the To Be or Not To Be soliloquy is diametrically opposed to the famous and familiar one. And Hamlet's dying words are not the enigmatic, the rest is silence. Instead, this Hamlet says devoutly, heaven receive my soul. In Q1, Gertrude explicitly denies any knowledge of the murder and vows to help her son to revenge. She and Horatio then team up to conspire against Claudius. Before I talk briefly about the text of Q1, though, I want to linger for a moment on its miraculous discovery after it had hidden unknown for so many years in that closet. For more than 200 years, no one knew it existed. The greatest Shakespearean actors and scholars of the 18th century never had the chance to read it. And it's easy to imagine that we might never have read it either. It's no great leap from 1 or 2 copies of a play surviving to 0 surviving. Q1 Hamlet might easily have been lost forever. For me, this is a powerful and haunting reminder of the precariousness of our cultural history and of the need to protect it for the future and to pass it on to that future. This is the work of a place like Penn, after all, work done in our classrooms when we teach Shakespeare to another generation of students who may have read him before, but not, we think, in quite the way they will read him here. And it is work done in our library at the Kislak Center, which houses, carefully preserves, and makes available to students the first folio of Shakespeare, among many other treasures. When I teach Q1 Hamlet to students, we spend quite a lot of time on Hamlet's famous soliloquy, To Be or Not To Be. Now, you've all heard this speech so often that it's easy to become numb to just how beautiful it is and to just how radical a speech it was for its day. When we read the famous version, alongside the very different version preserved in Q1, however, its power is renewed for us. One of the odd things about the famous version of Hamlet's soliloquy is that it completely refuses to do what a soliloquy is supposed to do, tell us about the inner thoughts of a character. In this speech, there is no character. Hamlet never uses the first-person pronoun, never says I. The speech is entirely abstract. And this abstraction is part of Hamlet's consistent refusal of selfhood under the pressure of the task the ghost has laid upon him. In his first soliloquy, he considers suicide. Later, he wishes he were an actor, dissolving the self into a scripted role. And here, in To Be or Not to Be, he dissolves the self into intellectual abstraction. But this abstraction also results from the form of the speech. Hamlet has recently come home from a university like this one, and the speech is, in fact, a school exercise, the kind of thesis Hamlet would have written to practice logic and rhetoric. Such theses explicitly had to be composed in the abstract, without reference to one's own life. In surviving university exams from Shakespeare's day, as in modern debate classes, students must argue first the pro side of a question and then the con side. And the most frequent question was, should a man take a wife? It was only men at university then. But another common one was, is it better to be unhappy or not to be at all? A version of Hamlet's own question. It's therefore not surprising that Hamlet's speech is organized according to a rigorous binary logic that mirrors university training in debate, pro and con, and that begins with a statement of the question, or what my students call the paper prompt, to be or not to be, to suffer slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against the sea of troubles. But this binary logic consistently breaks down because what Hamlet has seen and heard cannot be easily accommodated in an either-or approach. Either death is nothing else but sleeping, unconsciousness, or death, like sleeping, may involve some other form of consciousness, dreaming. And here uncertainty sets in. Aye, there's the rub. Again, Hamlet divides the question into two options. Should we bear those ills we have here on earth, or fly to others that we know not of after death? This is an either-or that Hamlet cannot resolve because of the impossibility of knowing what happens after death. And it leads to his conclusion. It's this dread of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns, that puzzles the will and prevents us from acting at all. So in this constantly bifurcating speech, Hamlet ends up stuck, unable to choose either path. But notice that Hamlet's conclusion is a very strange thing for him to say. No traveler returns from the undiscovered country. Hamlet has just seen this firsthand, and we have seen him see it right there on stage. His father has come back from the dead as a ghost. Hamlet should know that death is not mere unconsciousness. His university logic is not serving him very well here. The famous existential skepticism of the speech comes at the expense of Hamlet's personal history, his identity. It also comes at the expense of his faith. Hamlet is a Christian, after all. He ought to know, therefore, that there is another man who famously returned from the undiscovered country. Hamlet's entire soliloquy is premised on his forgetting of Christ. The radical skepticism of the speech overthrows all authority, whether that of Hamlet's own father or of God the Father. Now let's take a look at Q1's version. It too follows a powerful binary logic, but this same form leads to a completely opposite idea about the afterlife. And now I'll apologize because I'm not an actor, but I'll read you the speech. To be or not to be? Aye, there's the point. To die, to sleep. Is that all? Aye, all. No, to sleep, to dream. Aye, marry, there it goes. For in that dream of death when we awake, and born before an everlasting judge from whence no passenger ever returned, the undiscovered country at whose sight the happy smile and the accursed damned. But for this, the joyful hope of this, who'd bear the scorns and flattery of the world, scorned by the right rich, the rich cursed of the poor, the widow being oppressed, the orphan wronged, the taste of hunger or a tyrant's reign, and 1,000 more calamities besides to grunt and sweat under this weary life, when that he may his full quietus make with a bare bodkin. Who would this endure but for a hope of something after death, which puzzles the brain and doth confound the sense, which makes us rather bear those evils we have, than fly to others that we know not of. By that, oh, this conscience makes cowards of us all. Now this Hamlet begins with the same question, or the point, and he imagines death as a kind of sleep before correcting himself by thinking of dreams after death. But now the two versions diverge. It's not the fear of bad dreams that worries this Hamlet. Rather, death itself is the dream, from which we will surely awaken. When we awake, Hamlet says, and that when signals his certain faith. This is not the theology of the familiar to be or not to be, but rather of John Donne's great poem, Death Be Not Proud, which concludes, one short sleep past, we wake eternally, and death shall be no more. Death, thou shalt die. Death is merely temporary, a short sleep or a dream, for Christ has conquered death and returned to tell us the good news. Hamlet's faith leads him naturally to the scene of divine judgment. It is the joyful hope, not the dread of something after death, that gives us the strength to endure this life of suffering. In Q1, what makes us rather bear those evils we have than fly to others that we know not of is simply the fear of the last judgment, when we may be among the accursed who are damned. Suicide would mean an eternity of incomprehensible torment in hell, and so instead we bear those evils we have in the joyful hope of heaven. Unlike the radically skeptical, even atheistic version of the speech we're all familiar with, Q1's version presents a powerfully traditional Christian vision. This Hamlet knows exactly what happens after death, divine judgment followed by heaven or hell. What are we to make of this difference? I think the difference matters a great deal. We're presented not only with two diametrically opposed soliloquies and two conceptions of the character of Hamlet, we're also presented with two very different Shakespeares. One is more familiar, a Shakespeare who's constantly questioning received wisdom, skeptical, meditative, challenging convention, the artist as revolutionary. The other Shakespeare, the one we can glimpse in Q1, is less exciting, but maybe also part of who he was. This Shakespeare's Hamlet ponders the mysteries of life, death, and the afterlife, and comes to conclusions that young William Shakespeare would have heard every week from the pulpit at Holy Trinity Church in Stratford-upon-Avon, where he was baptized and buried. 400 years after that burial, we're still trying to figure out which Hamlet, which Shakespeare. Thank you.
Now I am alone. Well, no, I'm telling a lie. I'm not alone. You're all here. And that's not even counting the people watching online at this moment who are present in time, but not in space, or those who are watching this later who are present in neither. Hamlet says the same thing, now I am alone, before his soliloquy, "Oh, what a rogue and peasant slave am I?" And he, too, is lying. The audience is right there in the theater. He's talking to them. I'll come back to this in a moment. My goal today is to try to account for the perennial popularity of Hamlet the play and of Hamlet the role over the more than 4 centuries since the play first appeared. The theater critic, belletrist, and caricaturist Max Beerbohm, on reviewing the play for the umpteenth time in 1899, called the role of Hamlet a hoop through which every eminent actor must sooner or later jump. Now, why is this the case? The answer for many is that there's something transhistorical, dare I use the word universal, about the character. One popular writer, who will remain nameless, would have us believe that in creating the role of Hamlet, Shakespeare had invented the human, that's his phrase, creating for the first time psychology and inwardness and interiority, a person whose sensibility is the product of a web of psychobiographical determinants, and that as all this corresponds to the human truths under which we moderns operate, the role speaks to us across the centuries. Numerous scholars in the 1980s and 1990s, breathing the more rarefied air of the Academy, believe the opposite, that Hamlet struggles with his misplaced faith in new beliefs about subjectivity and psychology, epitomized by his assertion that he has that within which passeth show, and succeeds only in making himself miserable, until he is willing to surrender his putative autonomy to the divinity that shapes his ends. According to this reading, the play's subsequent popularity is the product of modern audiences' wishful thinking about the very subjectivity that Hamlet lacks. I believe neither of these explanations. I believe instead that the answer might lie in Hamlet's lie, when he says that he's alone when he is in fact standing in the middle of the theater. One of the most noteworthy and obvious features of the play is the number, length, and seeming intimacy of the soliloquies. But soliloquies in Shakespeare's theater were not inward ruminations, but direct addresses to the audience gathered in the playhouse. The convention of direct address, previously used by Shakespeare to show us characters explaining themselves, is in Hamlet used to show a character trying to explain himself to himself. This creates the illusion of psychological autonomy, of Hamlet inhabiting his own mental and spiritual world. But it simultaneously reminds us of the artifice of the theater. The actors standing on stage acknowledging the spectators in the playhouse who sit like guilty creatures at a play watching. In his soliloquies, Hamlet is doing to himself what the other characters are doing to him, trying to nail him down, to intuit his depths, to pluck out the heart of his mystery. And we in the theater do the same, or at least we try to. We assume that Hamlet succeeds in understanding himself better than the other characters in the play understand him. I'm not so sure. The play asks, famously in its first line, "Who's there?" But Shakespeare, the theatrical craftsman, is asking us to consider, how do we know who's there? And what makes us think we can know who's there? Shakespeare is reinventing not the human, but the conventions of theatrical performance, experimenting with the dramaturgical structures by which the drama tells its human stories in theatrical performance. And if indeed Hamlet was Shakespeare's experiment in the phenomenology of acting and character, like all experiments, we can't assume that the experiment was a success. Now, where does this leave the actor playing the role? Over the past 4 centuries, the role of Hamlet has invited myriad and multiple theatrical embodiments and interpretations. Not, I'd like to suggest, because Shakespeare, the master creator of literary character, created a multivalent, psychologized being with all the complexities of life, but because Shakespeare, the theatrical craftsman, has created a representational conundrum. How can we really know who this person is? That each generation of theater artists confidently solves by reading into the role what they believe constitutes psychology, using the aesthetic conventions of theatrical storytelling of their own times. And we in the audience, who can understand the character only through the actor's performance, think that we know the character because the actor thinks he does. And we have no choice but to understand the character in the ways the actor does. Let me give you a few examples. Henry Irving, the great English actor in the 1880s, set Hamlet's encounter with Osric before the duel outdoors in a garden, in the open air. Why else would a prince keep telling a foppish courtier to put on his hat? He wasn't making fun of Osric in this version, he was just being polite. It's not that Hamlet had to fit into the pictorial scenery, though Victorian Shakespeare productions were indeed slavishly and elaborately pictorial. It's that the pictorial served as a context to explain the behavior that for the Victorians made Prince Hamlet Prince Hamlet. Another example, in the 1930s, and again in his 1948 film, Laurence Olivier read into the role unresolved Oedipal fixations, espoused by Freud's English disciple Ernest Jones, whom he and the stage director Tyrone Guthrie went to visit and talk with before they produced the play on the English stage in the 30s. Now, it's not that mid-20th century actors were obsessed with Freud, though many were. But for Olivier's generation, any dramatic action, or according to Olivier's reading, inaction, requires a psychobiographical cause, and Freud offered one that made sense to them. And forgive me for raising this, what about Hamlet's famous inaction, which we were all taught about in high school? Perhaps it is only our own way of describing dramatic and theatrical behavior that does not conform to our own assumptions about what is psychologically credible. We don't understand Hamlet's actions, so it must be that he is failing to act. 2 brief contemporary examples, which seem similar but in significant ways are not. will serve to illustrate our own aesthetically eclectic times. In just the past few weeks, the Royal Shakespeare Company opened its new production of Hamlet with the 25-year-old London-born actor Paapa Essiedu playing the part. This was the first time in the history of the Royal Shakespeare Company, at least, that an actor of African ancestry played the part. Meanwhile, just last year, the Wilma Theater here in Philadelphia presented Hamlet with the Anglo-Sierra Leonean actor Zainab Jah as Hamlet. The RSC production, directed by Simon Godwin, sets the play in a Central African dictatorship, recontextualizing the play's location and politics, in part to rationalize the actor's race, much as Gregory Doran did with his all-black Julius Caesar for the RSC in 2012. The Wilma's production was, the director, Blanca Ziska, claimed, this is her phrase, anti-psychological, replacing character and psychology with political positionality and with an examination of the family. But unlike the current RSC production, the political world, which she thought was so important, was left historically and geographically unspecific. The actor's race was therefore, if not erased, then at the very least left unforegrounded and uncontextualized. Oh, did I mention that Zainab Jah is a woman? That too, while no doubt, adding a quality to the performance, was neither explained nor contextualized. So in today's theater, does the gender of the actor signify or does it not? Does the race of the actor signify or does it not? Does the nationality of the actor and the accent of the actor signify or does it not? These are questions that a production invites us, and an actor invites us to engage in before we can understand who the character is and what the character is doing. My point is not that these two actors, Essiedu and Jah, have different interpretations of the role, though there no doubt are differences, but that there are fundamental differences in how they interpret the roles and how we are asked to decode what we're seeing. That is, the aesthetic system, the set of theatrical conventions through which the spectator is asked to understand who the character is through the body, temperament, and presence of the actor on the stage. In the character of Hamlet, Shakespeare left us, in his theatrical script, a series of questions which, even in his own theater, I like to think he left unanswered. And for 4 centuries, actors have been answering these questions, confident that those questions are answerable, filling in the blanks with their own assumptions about emotion, behavior, psychology, and motivation. For Hamlet, the purpose of playing is to hold, as 'twere, the mirror up to nature. Hamlet the play and Hamlet the role allow us to hold the mirror up to our own ways of playing. If Hamlet in performance seems recognizably human to us, it is because we are seeing, via the actor's performance, not Shakespeare's Hamlet, but ourselves.
So why we didn't plan it, you'll see there's some interesting continuities between what Cary's saying and what Zach has said. So here we are, 400 years after the death of Shakespeare, and for how long have we been talking about Hamlet? Well, not quite 400 years, but for a very, very long time indeed. So why has it bothered people so much over the centuries? Now, and as Cary and I think Zach have both suggested, perhaps it is because the play presents itself as a puzzle, as its protagonists and others are constantly asking questions. What just happened? What's happening now? And what's the problem with Hamlet anyway? And if both of my co-presenters have suggested, no clear answers are given. So in her book, Hamlet Without Hamlet, my Penn colleague, Margherita de Grazia, has detailed the astonishing 200-year history of why does Hamlet delay? And this particularly from the time when psychology first came into the picture. So she notes how answers to the question of Hamlet's delay keep piling up, from sensitivity to excessive meditation, to melancholia, to guilt, to the wound of castration. But all these readings derive from the Romantic assumption that action is essentially the expression of character. So like de Grazia, and I think in a different way from what Cary does, but also similarly, I want to push back against the idea that the character of Hamlet should explain everything. I'm not saying that the play Hamlet does not allow for the idea of Hamlet to have an inner man or self. Rather, I'm saying that I'm first interested in the action in Hamlet. So in these brief remarks, I'm going to reflect on two aspects of action in Hamlet, where action is represented as the choice to do something, particularly in a crisis or the panic of a moment. So first, I want to look at the relationship between choice and character, how choice does or does not shape character. And second, I'm going to talk about choice and consequences in the plot of the play. I'm asking you all here to think about matters in Hamlet a little bit differently than you might be used to doing so. So for a long time now, I've been looking at how in classical and Shakespearean tragedy, character is defined through action, and especially in a choice made in a crisis. So when confronted by such a critical choice, tragic protagonists often become what they choose. So when Oedipus chooses to pursue his murder inquiry rather than to back away from the disastrous truth, he defines himself as someone who values knowledge above everything else. When in Iphigenia at Aulis, Agamemnon chooses to sacrifice his child Iphigenia, he only then becomes that implacable warrior. And when Macbeth in an instant chooses to murder Duncan, he sets a course to be reduced to a man of blood and a tyrant. But the trick with Hamlet is that it enacts too many changes on the choice to act or not in time. So it holds up to light what happens when you hesitate to act in a crisis, or when you act rashly or you make a mistake, or when you choose not to choose, submitting to some idea of destiny. So the play moves in a really strange way through these dilated scenes, through stops and starts, or what Claudius calls its countless abatements and delays. So in a typical revenge tragedy of its time, and Shakespeare is here riffing on earlier revenge tragedies, the protagonist does delay acting, but only because he's looking for the right moment to achieve that revenge. And of course, if he doesn't delay, it's going to be a very, very short play. So Hamlet seems either to miss that right moment, failing to kill Claudius when he's praying, or just to misfire, as when he stabs Polonius by mistake. So as Frank Kermode once put it simply, if Hamlet is a play of action and Hamlet himself is a player and an actor, sometimes the play makes him a very bad one. So what I would argue that in Hamlet, where the choice to act is thus delayed or done in error, the construction of tragic character through choice is fundamentally disrupted. Hamlet's not killing Claudius when he's praying defers the question of who or what Hamlet is, and Hamlet himself can't explain his own delay, as he confesses, "I do not know why yet I live to say the thing to do, since I have cause and will and strength and means to do it." And his mistaken killing of Polonius still leaves the question open. Who is he? Does his rash stabbing of Polonius make him a murderer? Was it really him who commits the murder? That is both intentional and unintentional? Indeed, Hamlet says to Laertes that it wasn't Hamlet who killed Polonius, rather Hamlet's madness. Was Hamlet wrong, Laertes? Well, never Hamlet. If Hamlet from himself be ta'en away, and when he's not himself does wrong Laertes, then Hamlet does it not. Hamlet denies it. So Hamlet thus separates himself, his character, from that action, splitting open the idea of character itself, and character becomes this kind of strange mystery and state of contingency. So the focus of the tragic problem of choosing, of course, also makes us ask then about how such choices are made if they're not driven solely by the impulses of some pre-existing deep-seated self. So are we to understand that the tragic protagonist's choices are instead just predetermined by a power that human beings have variously called the gods, God, fate, or destiny, a power that's identified with the shape of the story as it's always been told and modeled by a playwright? In a tragedy, is that choice that's made in a crisis truly free, or has it always been meant to happen? To what extent are we meant to imagine the protagonist is a free agent in choosing in a story that's already been written? So I would argue at the same time that the play Hamlet exposes the vexed relationship with character and choice made in present time, it also disrupts how we think about tragic choice and consequences, and this is the second part of my argument. So let me focus briefly on what happens in Act 5. There, Hamlet tells Horatio of his actions on shipboard on the way to England, where, again, acting rashly in the night, he sought out the commission that Rosencrantz and Guildenstern were bearing to England, and this is the commission that directs the King of England to kill Hamlet. Hamlet associates this rashness, this choosing to act without thinking too much, with, he calls, a divinity that shapes our ends, rough hew them what we will. But at the same time, Hamlet's rash action leads to his rewriting the commission, thus creating what he sees as an alternative ending to his own story, sending Rosencrantz and Guildenstern to death rather than himself. The play thus sends two potentially conflicting signals. A character interferes in the plot, or at least with Claudius's plotting, breaking open the story as it was supposed to be told, yet at the same time, that move itself is evidently already latent in the play's rough-hewn shape. But after telling the story to Horatio, when faced by Osric's invitation to the fencing match with Laertes, Hamlet notoriously chooses not to choose at the heart of now. He replies in the folio version, "Not a whit, we defy augury. There's a special providence in the fall of a sparrow. If it be now, 'tis not to come. If it be not to come, it will be now. If it be not now, yet it will come. The readiness is all." So paradoxically, he thus resists the prophetic inkling of his own death by accepting that he will die eventually. But the last words of the second quarto version of this speech added on, which is "let be," the answer to be or not to be, transform the anxiety of choice in the pure present into an acceptance of all the latent ways to the end. So these lines rehearse all the possibility of the relationship between choosing now and the time to come. But the very instability of these lines between the folio and the second quarto, not to speak of Zach's first quarto, where you won't find this passage at all, underlies all the contingency of language itself as it makes up the play. The lines themselves that speak of the future exist in a state of uncertainty. So the essence of what Hamlet says here is that the only thing we can be certain of now is our knowledge of this moment, but we know of our future is only the certainty of our death. But does this leave everything closed down with a sense of the fatality at the end and Hamlet's choosing not to choose? In his book on Hamlet, Eric Levy observed that as part of the kind of openness of the play that I've already noted, that in Hamlet's consistently not choosing, Hamlet himself is intimately associated with hypothetical alternatives, with wishing and wondering and deferring, persisting in what Levy calls the subjunctive mood. Along with the act in which he rewrites Claudius's commission, the moment in which Hamlet defies augury both opens up and closes off the possibility that the story could end differently. There would, he imagines, be many alternative paths to the end, yet however, whenever, he says, it will come. Wiley Cipher has also noted the significance that Hamlet's end comes in a game, the fencing match with Laertes, a fiction of combat that actually turns out to be real combat, while of course it's also part of a play. So it's a game that appears to be one of skill, matching two combatants, but it's also a murder plot, entailing Claudius's backup plan to poison Hamlet if the envenomed foil doesn't work. Though a structure of a game implies that within the rules of the game, the outcome is open-ended, depending only on skill or perhaps chance. But this match is also a plot composed by Claudius and Laertes, so open-ended gameplay thus collides with narrative purpose. So in this collision, the rules are broken, the game turns deadly, but Claudius's plot is foiled indeed. So while this catastrophe is usually understood to reaffirm that rashness or indiscretion serves the ends of divinity when R.D. plots do Paul, the rapidity and chaos of the final scene for me reinforces the sense that for the moment any outcome seems possible and that it is an open and it's not a closed matter. And indeed, in my closing, let me remind you that another outcome would have indeed have been possible and even familiar to Shakespeare's audience. For in several of Shakespeare's sources, the Hamlet predecessor character does not die at this point. Rather, he achieves his revenge by violently severing his usurper's uncle's head, burning down the palace and living to reign for many years after as king. So Hamlet doesn't have to die now after all? Is this just the consummation that we would wish for as an audience? So we're not going to stop talking about Hamlet, I think, for many more years, because the play just asks us to question so many of our assumptions about character, choice, consequence, and endings. So with that, this is my end. And now we'll take questions.
Any evidence that Shakespeare, like a modern playwright, was tuning up his play as he went along, and perhaps perfecting Hamlet as a puzzle along the way?
Zach, do you want to take that?
Yeah, we don't know, but that one of the this is one of the big questions about what exactly this first edition of Hamlet is. One answer that a number of scholars have put forward is that it's Shakespeare's rough draft of the play, and that what we have in the essentially the modern version, which is comprised of these other two texts, is a revision as he perfected the play. I don't know that that totally works, because there are parts of the first edition that are very similar, almost verbatim, to the familiar version. And so in those parts, what we have is very nice iambic pentameter verse. That sounds like Shakespeare sounded like. That really sounds like any professional dramatist from the period sounded like. And in other parts, we have lines that don't really sound like poetry at all, that don't work metrically, that are not 10 syllables long. So to imagine it as Shakespeare's rough draft, we have to kind of imagine that sometimes he remembered how to write an iambic pentameter, and sometimes he totally forgot, and then he figured it out later. So I'm not sure about that. The other main theory of that version is that it's an attempt by some actors to remember the play, essentially the one we know, and to write it down from their fairly bad memories in order to create a script that maybe they needed to perform, or that they wanted to sell to a publisher to make a few pounds. In which case they might be remembering things that were in first version and that Shakespeare took out. I mean, they may remember things that no longer appear in the play, but that were once in the play and aren't simply their bad memory. But we really don't know. We certainly think Shakespeare revised some of his plays, since he worked for a long time in the theater, and very few playwrights who have plays that continue to be performed over a decade or more won't tinker with them a little bit as they go along. But we don't have solid evidence of it.
My question was in these revisions, he perfecting Hamlet as a puzzle? Is that the trend from the first to the last? I think Zach's answer to your question dovetails very nicely with Rebecca's point about choice and decision. Because whether the first quarto is an earlier draft and we're seeing revisions, or a misremembered or pirated version, I'm of the revision theory myself, but notwithstanding. One of the significant changes, I know you and I have disagreed about its implications, is scene order. So if the character has a sequence of branching decision tree options that takes him down a path, when those events happen are different in Q1 than they are in Q2. And you sometimes see a contemporary director use the Q1 scene order. What's interesting about the Q1 scene order is in some ways it makes more sense. So if Q2 and F are a revision, he's actually shaking up a logical sequence and making it more irrational and more harder to explain the options and the consequences of the choices that are made.
I can give you one more quick example of that. If we take the first version to be Shakespeare's rough draft, where we see him making things more obscure. We never, for a long time, people have debated what exactly Gertrude knew and when she knew it, right? Did she maybe help to plot to kill Claudius? Was she having, to kill old Hamlet? Was she having an affair with Claudius maybe before the murder? in Q1, it's very clear. She didn't know anything about the murder. She is totally innocent of that. And as soon as she learns of it, she says, "I'll help you get rid of Claudius," to her son. Now, when this version was discovered in the Victorian period, everyone was extremely relieved because here we saw, it turns out Gertrude's a good woman, she's a good mother, she's going to protect her son, she's not having an affair. But it was also immediately recognized that, maybe that if this is a rough draft, Shakespeare is deliberately taking this certainty out to create more of a puzzle. That would be one way to read that change.
And following up on that, could it perhaps be an ecclesiastical version, including all the stuff about, poor people and the whole thing?
I think it is possible that's behind Q1 in one way or another is a version that's been tidied or purified a little bit. We have that in To Be or Not To Be. We have it in his dying words. We also have other moments where there seems to be an attempt to make the female characters more virtuous. So I just talked about Gertrude, but Ophelia too. You remember that there's a moment where Ophelia tells her father that she saw Hamlet all disheveled, half naked, and he came to her in her chamber as she was sewing. And this is part of the evidence of his madness that Polonius takes to be about love for Ophelia. In Q1, instead, Ophelia says that she was walking in the gallery when Hamlet came to her. And the gallery is a very public space. It's the same space where the king and queen and Polonius watch Hamlet give To Be or Not To Be. So what we don't have in Q1 is the image of this half-naked man somehow knowing how to get to Ophelia's private bedroom and being able to get in there, right? Which might suggest that they are having some kind of sexual relationship before marriage as well. And famously in Kenneth Branagh's film, he does have made-up scenes of Hamlet and Ophelia having sex. Also in the Ethan Hawke version, they do that. There's another point where maybe the women are purified in some way.
The actor's answer to the question, did Hamlet sleep with Ophelia, was only when it was on tour in Chicago.
Always in my production.
There's another question over here. Or not.
Wait, yeah, so I think, Cecilia.
I was going to ask you about the significance of the presence of Ophelia, but you did partially answer. I was just wondering whether she was created to satisfy the audience demand or interest for any romantic element in any play, but it does reconfirms to me, Hamlet's character for indecision and ambiguity of his attitude toward people. But do you have a definite answer or opinion on the significance of Ophelia's presence?
Well, certainly she functions there as a kind of foil for Hamlet. I always say if Hamlet pretends madness, she really goes mad. And I think also as a way of, if we focus on the way in which he treats her and abuses her, that is part of the means of defining his character. I will say, as was mentioned in the introduction, I've been, in my current research, I'm working on video games, and you should all know that under development is a video game called Elsinore, which features Ophelia as the heroine who was going to save, who was going to prevent this disaster and save, all the family that is, that has been entrapped in the disaster of Elsinore. So there's been an interesting tendency now as now has been exemplified in this video game, to reposition and change the characterization of Ophelia again. And Cary might want to comment on the way that Ophelia has been acted over, periods of time.
Too big a subject for me to try to nail down.
Right, exactly.
I'll pass on that one, but what you're saying about the video game, what strikes me is the number of fictions that are being created, partly through the current trends in fan fiction, but also in novels that tell what in the trade is called the backstory, which never used to be part of everyone's vocabulary, and now is. You know, that there must be some reason why this person became the person. So if you do a 2-hour film version of How the Grinch Stole Christmas, you need to explain his thwarted love affair with a different Who in Whoville or something. But certainly the novel Wicked and the show giving the backstory of Wizard of Oz, and fan fiction which imagines characters in other situations. I think that very much speaks to our desire to have characters that can be accounted for, and behavior that can be accounted for.
Yeah, another. Just to follow up on that, I mean, one of the moments that one of Ophelia's big scenes, right, is the Nunnery Scene with Hamlet, and this is, I think, a kind of a mirror of every generation's understanding of Hamlet, because in some periods in the 19th century, this was really considered just too horrible a thing for Hamlet to do. The way he screams at Ophelia and berates her in this scene, so much so that it was frequently performed that Hamlet would see Polonius kind of peeping out from behind a curtain in this scene, and this would motivate his vitriol towards Ophelia, whereas there's no evidence that anyone in Shakespeare's day found this particularly horrifying or inappropriate behavior. We have a copy of the first folio in Japan, at Meisei University in Japan, which is heavily annotated by a reader roughly contemporary with Shakespeare, and this reader is interested in passages that he can quote in other contexts and use as interesting bits of wisdom, kind of like familiar quotations. And so when Polonius is talking to Laertes, he has a little note that says, "Good advice to a son who's traveling." And in the Nunnery Scene, next to some of these really angry and vitriolic lines, it just says, "Dissuasion of a woman to marriage." So, as if you want to dissuade someone to get married, you would recite these scenes. So there's no uneasiness there, right? But by the 19th century, that's just not in keeping with British codes of manliness.
I think it was the production at the Wilma where a female was playing Hamlet, and I have a question: was the entire production sort of a gender-bent production, or was it just Hamlet who was changed within that role?
That was the only change in gender of the actor, but not the character.
Oh,
And, you know, I cited that production as an example of code shifting. But I have to tell you, I found the codes so incoherent in that production that I don't know what the hell is going on.
so I guess within productions where there's a certain kind of gender bending, do you think that opens up a conversation about gender dynamics within Shakespeare, or in a sense kind of blankets over it by changing that?
I think it could do several things. It could in fact open up a conversation about gender. It can accidentally reify aspects of gender, which the director may not have been conscious of doing or thought was doing other work. There's a video of a 1980s, 70s production of Hamlet that Joe Papp directed with the actress Diana Venora as Hamlet. And there's a documentary about the rehearsal process, and there's a scene where, I can't remember what scene it is, but he's berating her, Ophelia-like, she's playing Hamlet, to cry in this scene. And he finally says, "Why do you think I cast a woman?" But other things that type of crossing can do is to make you aware of theatrical layering, make you aware of the actor or the performer in the role. And that is one of many ways to achieve that type of doubleness. So there's no one way that functions.
There's an incredible film that I have to mention because you can view it on YouTube, an early silent film starring the Scandinavian actress Asta Nielsen as Hamlet, in which, so Hamlet for a long time was thought to be particularly feminine because he does not act, because he's so sensitive, right? In this production, Hamlet is a woman. She's not a female actress playing a male character. Hamlet is secretly a woman. The king and queen have had a princess, but in order to secure the succession to the throne, they've raised Hamlet as a boy. It's a
That-
fascinating idea.
That's why she rejects Ophelia, because Ophelia doesn't know that.
It's an
And,
incredible
and,
film.
and she has a crush on Horatio.
So you can see it. I think it's in its entirety available on YouTube.
Yeah, it's
amazing.
wonderful. It's wonderful.
Yeah, I could ask a question of all three of you, particularly Cary maybe. What's the production of Hamlet you've seen that was most transformed by its setting and its audience and its place? And one you think I could say for me, it was a production I saw in communist East Germany in 1977, the Weimar Festival, where, you know, the line, Denmark's a prison, is literally true because anybody who tried to leave that country would be shot. The tension was unbearable and led to Ophelia's mad scene. She flipped out her boobs from her bodice and ran around the stage. And the old man next to me stood up and said, "Stick them in, Reinstecken, Reinstecken." The tension was phenomenal. It was all about being in communist East Germany in a place you could never leave.
I envy you seeing a transformatively transcendent and meaningful production of Hamlet, because I've seen many, and of my life list of astonishing and extraordinary Shakespeare productions, I don't think Hamlet's on that list. I haven't been as lucky on that. But what you say about particularly Eastern European before the fall of the Iron Curtain, many famous productions in Poland, Soviet Union as well, where the political context resonated far more than one would have expected. Actually, I stand corrected. I did see Ingmar Bergman's production of the play with Peter Stormare back in the 80s, which was extraordinary, and it was in the days before they would put the simultaneous translation on the super titles. But I think I knew it.
Yeah, I would agree that I'm not sure I've ever seen a truly memorable performance of Hamlet. Mostly when you were asking the question, I was flipping through my memory bank and thinking, I can think of the bad ones I saw. I can think of the ones that I saw when everybody laughed at the end with all the bodies piled up on stage and they sort of conveniently all fell on a platform so that they could wheel them out. And I think that that's, part of it. It's a very difficult play to produce, A, because of our familiarity of it, and B, because of holding the tension between its comic and its tragic elements and audience response. And there are all these moments that it's hard, that they tip over, I think, in tones at so many points that it's a very difficult play to manage. You can say King Lear is the same way, but it's supposed to be that way. And I'm not sure that Hamlet, we know how to handle Hamlet as an audience.
Yeah, I agree. I haven't seen a fantastic one. I mean, the problem is that it's treated so reverentially, typically.
Exactly.
So directors don't do the kinds of things they often do with other Shakespeare plays. Cary probably will hate me for this. I kind of like the Ethan Hawke film version.
I love the
Oh, you do? Okay, I didn't know that. Which does set it in contemporary, then 2000 contemporary New York. First of all, Bill Murray is fantastic as Polonius. And there's a great scene, I think, in that the setting works to reveal something about the scene, which is in Ophelia's, one of her mad scenes, which can be pretty boring on stage, very decorously beautiful mad songs, which is kind of an odious way to think about those scenes, I think. But they set it in the Guggenheim Museum, that beautiful, rotunda. And what you get is a sense of the public nature of how shocking what she's doing in public and how much it reveals about the corruptness of the king and queen. And they're in a kind of very New York fundraising situation. And she comes in and she doesn't sing, she just lets out this piercing scream instead of singing one of these songs. And everyone looks, and you really, I think, get to the heart of that scene, of the politics of that moment, which a lot of productions just gloss right over and show you a kind of romanticized mad woman.
It's a wonderful film.